Hello, everyone. Tashitile, and welcome to our Tibet Talks. I'm Penche Gyatso, Director of Outreach at International Campaign for Tibet, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Thank you for joining us. In this series, we want to bring you live conversations about Tibet with inspiring thinkers, with leaders, activists, and artists. And we want to share with you some of the wisdom of Tibetan culture, teachings of His Holiness, and other issues as we go through these times. For our talk today, our guest is an international lawyer by training who, in the late 1990s, decided to combine his deep concerns for the people of Tibet with his interest in venturing into fiction by writing the mystery series, The Skull Mantra, where the first one is called The Skull Mantra. He won the Edgar Award for Best First Mystery and was listed as a finalist for Best Novel for the Year in Dublin's prestigious Impact Awards. The Skull Mantra launched the Inspector Shan mystery series, and which now includes a total of 10 novels. The Inspector Shan series has been translated into over 20 languages around the world. This is a mystery crime series that is set in Chinese-occupied Tibet. It's hard to imagine a good fiction that can be set in such a complex setting, but Eliot Pattison has managed to do this masterfully while also sharing the story of occupation, oppression, and tragedy of Tibet. So please join me as I welcome our speaker of the hour, Eliot Pattison.
Eliot. Thanks very much for that introduction. I appreciate that. It's a great honor to talk again with the International Campaign. As you know, I'm a big supporter of all the work that the campaign does, and I want to put some more color on the introduction. Okay, so the short line would be I'm an international lawyer who evolved into a novelist, but I had spent decades traveling around the world and worked on every continent other than Antarctica. I think it's important for this conversation for me to make a confession. I was an early China booster. Okay, so that means that there was this wave of interest in opening China when the U.S. normalized relations with China in 1980. I led the first delegation of American lawyers into China in January of 1980. It was a whole different world then, and I was one of the many optimistic and enthusiastic people that were trying to get international investment into China. That meant for the next 20 years I spent a lot of time in China in the lands that are occupied by China, in other parts of Asia, working with all levels of society, going from ministers of state to many mid-level bureaucrats, Communist Party members, workers, managers, professors, quite a cross section of people getting their perspectives on life in China, and that gave me a lot of interesting experience. First of all, I evolved a lot of insight into the way the Chinese government works and thinks about things. But given my predilection towards Tibetan Buddhism, I had studied Tibetan Buddhism in college, for example, and had a great interest in history of the region. I had a special eye out for the Tibetan experience, so I was taking every opportunity I could get to learn more about how the Tibetans were faring under Beijing's rule. Found a lot of alarming experiences, which we can talk about and with which the ICT is quite familiar. I gradually evolved into working more in Europe and South America, but my experiences in China stayed with me, and especially my experiences with Tibetans in China really began to gnaw at me. And I thought more and more of quote by George Orwell that if you want to glimpse the future, imagine a boot stomping a human face forever. And I realized that really was what was happening in Tibet. And if we didn't do something about it, it was going to spread. And so that's when I began, as you say, to write this mystery series.
Yes, I remember about 20 years ago when you first started, I picked up your first book at when I was traveling somewhere at an airport bookshop, and I was really pleasantly taken aback at how in-depth you wrote and understood, and you shared the story. So with that, thank you, Eliot. I'm going to bring in ICT President Matteo Macacci also to join in the conversation. Matteo?
Yes, hello.
Okay, and then, yes, and then Eliot, your book is very popular in our office. So we also have two of my other colleagues. I have Leslie Rich, Director of Special Programs, and Lizzie Ludwig, who's Director of Development, both of them joining the conversation as well. So Matteo, I'll hand over to you now.
Yes, thank you, Eliot, for doing this and already for sharing your background, how you got interested into China first and then, gradually, looking more closely at Tibet, that led you also to write more about that. So I think what would be interesting for our viewers would be to understand how you got the idea of, writing this mystery series cast in Tibet. What was the process? Was by traveling to China and experiencing yourself, because you knew already about the situation in Tibet, but did something change when you traveled there and you got some interaction that sparked the idea of, oh, I need to write about this?
Sure. First of all, I think to write it, you be a successful writer of fiction, you have to have a real passion for what you're writing, and I'm a great believer in having a message, woven into novels, and so I don't, I think those who know my novels know they have a lot of messages, but the overwhelming one being just, look at what's going on in Tibet, please. So I had read a great number of chronicles of Tibetans and Tibetans written in the diaspora around the world, but also really heart-wrenching chronicles of the occupation and the fight against the occupation. And clearly, they were very well done, but they were not widely distributed. I believe that part of the problem, and if you looked at just reports of human rights organizations, they were sort of statistical, which is understandable, but they were like history books. And I have a separate history series where this is also a theme, where it's one, and ICT understands this extremely well, because a great example is you can read in any number of places there have been terribly over 150 self-immolations.
Yeah.
And so people read that and sort of like, that's terrible. Okay. But the ICT has gone in and made biographies of every one of those people. And you can read those. And in fact, I have a whole book, Soul of the Fire, which was focused on the self-immolations. And that was a great resource for me. But that is so wrenching, so visceral, so personal. It takes the reader, or it takes the person learning more about Tibet, to a whole different level of emotional engagement, and that's what I was looking for. And I have there are other themes around Chinese history and tradition, intersecting with Tibetan tradition, but that's the general impetus for the books.
The idea to try to get this message and this information to a wider public and to make it accessible. And actually, and I must say that we struggle with that, especially with the question of self-immolation, because we struggle on how do we best communicate to people. Because when you see the image, it's a very strong image. It's very sad, it's very powerful, but also leaves you a little bit helpless. What do you do about this? Why someone decided to take their life, in such a situation. So I think being able to tell the story of those people would be great. But one of the biggest obstacles we face, and this is one of our campaigns, is that Tibet is closed off. You
Right.
cannot go. There has been no journalist who has been able from Beijing, they tried so many times, foreign journalists, to go to Tibet and talk to the families of the self-immolators, just to understand what happened, and there's no right or wrong or, who knows what the story behind, but they're not allowed to do that. So for you to focus on that, I think, even if it's fiction, it's very real because it's the thing that is most closer to reality that we can have. So we are very thankful for that. Yeah.
There's a great quote that you remind me of by Emerson about novels, and he said, "Fiction reveals truth that reality obscures." And my example is like the perfect example of that. Okay, because reality obscures all this, this terrible reality in Tibet, the reality of Chinese oppression and Chinese censorship, and so. I'm able, I think there's a great responsibility in writing these kinds of books to be authentic. Okay, so I'm able to take, the factual material and humanize it into stories. And of course, it's interesting to talk about, are these books tragedies or not? But there's certainly a huge element of human tragedy, in my books and in the Tibetan story. That is, I believe, very authentic.
Yeah, yeah. So since your background is a lawyer and you write about, political issues, social issues like this one, and you made a confession, right, at the start saying that you were an early booster of China. But this is very interesting nowadays because we see actually over the last couple of years, especially those of us who are in Washington, we have seen quite a big shift happening, even in the business community, which is starting to realize that, China is not a good partner, not even for doing business. There was this narrative for many years, you gotta make money, human rights are important, but money is, gonna alleviate poverty, it's gonna make everybody happier. So I think it would be interesting. What was your internal process? I mean, you changed quite a while ago. I mean, you started this book 20 years ago. I mean, so what sparked that, shift in your...
I was one of the, today, you're right. There's the people who now have a lot of remorse about helping China become an economic power. That's a big crowd. Okay. There's a lot of people in that category. There were a few of us, I started feeling that way in the late 1990s and I had worked with the Chinese government. I across the table, but sometimes I also advised the government. And I began to realize that there was no such thing as truth to them. There was only, the power of the Communist Party. And that's what everything was about. Every single issue you had would come down to some aspect of that. So you realized that you spent all this time negotiating contracts and they could care less about their contracts. They would make representations about what they intended to do with, if you were going to be a company was going to be a partner with them. And then it didn't matter. None of that mattered after the venture started up. They would just sort of do what they think. There were some exceptions, but I realized that there was some very terrible motivations behind what Beijing was doing on every front. And I pulled away from any of my work for the government, and I became much less enthusiastic about pushing companies to invest in China, and wound up really. Today I do a little consulting. I mean, people ask me today, it's all about precautions. And you're right, it's a massive shift, and it's in the context of the work that you do, it's I think you can almost say it's exciting because we're finally getting some. And you look at the Tibetan Support Act that's in Congress right now. You look at the press, and it's hugely overdue. But it's at least now it has come, and I think there is the ground is laid for a lot of great progress to be made.
Yeah, no, we share that optimism, and one topic that we have raised, and we started actually at ICT 5 years ago now, starting to ask the United States government and Congress first to call for reciprocity with China. So basically ask China to allow Americans to do the same in China that the Chinese are allowed to do here. And we took Tibet as an example, because Tibet is not only a region which is highly oppressed, but is also completely isolated from the other parts of China. Not even in Xinjiang, where they have these, terrible, imprisonment camps and all of that. They don't have a system in which they screen everybody who goes in, and you need a special permit. Actually, they keep a lot of control even there, but it's different. And actually, we were able to pass the first legislation, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, which is calling now for Chinese officials who are responsible for blocking access to Tibet to be sanctioned and basically not to be allowed to come to the US. And it was introduced by a Democrat, Jim McGovern, and
Yep.
it was passed by a Congress which was completely Republican and with the Republican president. So I think I haven't checked, but I'm pretty sure that was the only bill introduced by a Democrat that was passed during the Republican Congress. So I think that shows that kind of shift and will now by the political establishment to try to change the narrative around China. So.
Right. I think that's one of the sort of the silver linings to the cloud, that it is a great opportunity for bipartisan cooperation. It used to be, 20, 30 years ago, you look at the record of the U.S. on human rights, and the U.S., as a country and government was a far ahead the leader of human rights causes around the world. It was the U.S. that broke up the Soviet Union. It was the U.S. that brought the Berlin Wall down. The U.S. led the fight against apartheid successfully.
Yeah.
And that kind of disintegrated in the last 20 years, and things became much more partisan. And we need to get back to, bipartisan approaches, because it's much more consistent, with the American spirit and what the American people want, and other people around the world. And it's very satisfying that Tibet becomes the rallying cry for all that.
Yeah, and actually, I think, and then I'll move to my colleagues to continue the conversations, on the book. But my feeling actually now, especially on the Tibetan Policy and Support Act, and looking at what the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, is saying during these days, calling for unity for 7 billion human beings to try to tackle the challenges that we have, whether it's the pandemic or climate change, or the rise of nationalism, which is, at the basis also of this authoritarian government. Actually, I feel that in Congress, they need Tibet. Tibet needs the Congress, but I think, the United States needs also to get on these issues to try to preserve this culture, which is very precious for all of us and our challenges. So
absolutely agree, and it's a good perspective.
Thank you. So this is the latest of the series, Bones of the Earth, and it's available. It came out last year, and we have now our colleagues Leslie and Lizzie, who will dive a little bit deeper into the books. Leslie.
So hello, Eliot. It's lovely to see you again. This is also a larger question, but you write books about other topics as well. In fact, your series, The Bone Rather, deals with the impressions Native Americans faced in the 18th century. There are obvious parallels between what Indigenous Americans went through and what Indigenous Tibetans are going through now. At the same time, we're seeing protests around the country against systemic racism. How do you see the Tibetan struggle fitting into this larger history of racism and oppression and presented in your book?
Well, I think certainly there are a lot of common elements, and when I first started writing the historical series, a lot of my Inspector Shan readers said, "What are you doing? Why would you do something so vastly different?" And broadly, my response was that it really wasn't that different. Okay, the American Indians are very parallel to the Tibetans in terms of having a separate culture that was very deliberately dismantled, and the forces that essentially destroyed the tribes are really the same forces that are working in China today, just with a different technology, right? So I think these forces, there's currents and subcurrents of racism and oppression, and call it there. You could call it from you could put different labels to it, but a lot of it's sort of driven by greed and self-interest and trying to acquire power over others. and the both of these series of books are really all about that, about the downtrodden. When I talk to lawyers about these books, I point out that these are, in a sense, these are about what you might call natural justice, it's sort of common values of humanity that have to, need to that are fighting and need to win out against, legal structures and government structures that are oppressing people and denying them justice.
Lizzie, I think you had some questions.
I do. Thank you. Eliot, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for the talk. And I have been reading the first book in the series, Soul Mantra. I've been enjoying it a lot. And I wanted to ask, as someone who's worked at ICT for a number of years, I was really impressed by the amount of research you clearly put into the book. And as probably everyone watching knows, getting accurate information out of Tibet is not easy. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you performed research for this series.
Sure. I try, if you know the series very well, I try to have sort of a different theme in each of the books. So I have and I'll get back to that, but I started out with a fairly sort of a core knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism and history of Central Asia back when I started writing the Skull Mantra. And then I was reading, as I mentioned, the chronicles of Tibetans during the occupation, but also some of my favorite sources, because I have a lot of Bonpo people, the original, sort of the original religion in Tibet that was amalgamated with Buddhism, I think you could say, in a broad sense, a lot of my sources there were chronicles that were written by visitors in the 19th century. And there's not very many, but there's some in the early 20th century. And those are really fascinating, because people arriving in Tibet in the 1800s, really, that experience was probably the closest we would ever get on the planet to visiting a different planet. I mean, it was geographically totally different from anything anybody had experienced. The roof of the world, which has a lot of implications physically that people don't appreciate until they experience it. But totally, separate literature, separate, medicine, separate medical system, which is, really interesting and has lots of implications. Of course, a very unique religion, and a kind of a disdain for materialism and material technology, and so those, I weave those sort of themes into the books, and those are based on those old sources. I have, of course, a lot of direct experience, in China, and have talked to a lot of Tibetans, but I constantly am doing research. So every time I do one of these books, I spend more time on several new aspects, like Bones of the Earth had some scenes in the Sky Train, the train from Golmud, and there's a lot of aspects to that I wanted to learn more about, and the nature of contemporary Lhasa, and so which has changed so dramatically in the last decades. So it's a constant process. I mean, I gobble up lots of research. I collect some Tibetan artifacts. I acquire the knowledge any way I can. I used to go a lot to Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong, in Asia, and in London, there are a lot of books that are not available in the U.S. And so that was always fun to go to bookstores, in Hong Kong and London, and dig out old sources, especially secondhand stores, books that were printed in like 1880, things like that.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that I told Leslie that she cannot spoil the series for me because she's much further along than I am, but she did share that one of the things that was really moving for her is that you talk a lot about mining in the most current book in the series. So I'm excited to get to that point.
Yeah, Tibet. Tibet. One of the aspects of Tibet that all of you I know appreciate is that there's never there's no end to the issues, right? I mean, there's lessons about the environment, about religion, about spirituality overall, about personal freedoms, about medicine. You could go on and on. I mean, it is. I've said in different contexts that Tibet is a really, really effective lens for understanding ourselves and what we've done with the world, because you can look there and see the contrast so vividly.
Thank you. Leslie, do you want to go back to your next question?
Well, one thing actually that hadn't come up that so far is with these Inspector Shan books is what I enjoyed, especially in Bones of the Earth, which I have finished and I promise not to spoil. And I don't think this is spoiled. Is it offers some hope, and I really appreciate that. There's little glimmers of hope in there. And then I was sad to read that it could be the last book in the series. And I was wondering, is there any chance we'll see Inspector Shan and you'll return to Tibet again?
So I'll respond to a couple of your points. First of all, some people, I exchange emails with readers all over the world, and one of the common threads through emails is your books are so dark, and how do you write such dark books for so many years? And on that point, I don't consider them to be that dark. I consider them to be reflective of a dark experience. Yes. But as all of you can relate to very well, the Tibetans are a great example of how, and there's some famous quotes from a Jesuit about this, how we are, we're not human beings, having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience, and so there's great lessons there, and my books in many different ways underscore that point. It's all about the triumph of the human spirit. Okay, I have so I don't have an 11th book under contract. And I'm working on some other books right now, but I believe I will get back to Shan, and I have not given up on Tibetan issues at all, and I'm having them woven into some of my new stuff.
Well, that's excellent. And I maybe because I know a lot about the issue is that I find them very hopeful. I mean, I see the hope in there, and it makes me quite happy. So thank you. Lizzie?
Yes. So one other burning question I have is that I'm really curious about your decision to have the book be written from the perspective of Inspector Shan, as a native Chinese person. And I'm curious about how you came to that decision, and what that character kind of allows you to say about the reality of Chinese rule in Tibet.
So, and I know you folks understand this, but our adversary here isn't the Chinese people; it's the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese people themselves, and I've had a lot of experience with many different Chinese in and out of China, are wonderful people, and they have a fascinating history and themselves, and that history involves being what we would call very spiritual, and very they have very common values with the rest of us. They've been victimized by the Communist Party as well as the Tibetans, not so so adversely, not so physically, not so violently, but they are victims too. So I want to make that point, and I should also just add there a footnote. If we're going to win this cause, if we're going to get Tibet back to the Tibetans, the Chinese people have to be very much part of that equation. And I think, and I would be hopeful that they can be part of that equation. And I think there's a lot of signs of that we can talk about if you want. And then back to your question in terms of sort of just the crafting of the novels. I realized that if I had a Tibetan as my protagonist, it would not provide the same opportunity for learning about Tibet, because it would get more artificial. The Tibetan would already know everything. And having an outsider coming in, especially an outsider who's thrown into a prison, with Tibetans, he has to, and therefore the reader has to learn very rapidly about Tibet and Tibetans. And it's such a dense, complex topic that it's easily gone 10 books with Shan still learning more and more, that he didn't know before.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And I think we're going to throw it back to Tencho now to address some of the questions that have come in from our viewers.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie, Mateo, Eliot. We have questions coming in from our audience for you. I want to read first from Brian Phillips. It's a question. Brian writes, I'm hoping you might comment on the politics of archaeological work done in Tibet and other ethnic minority parts of China. One of your earlier Shan novels, he says the title eludes me at the moment, dealt with this as the central theme. Has there been any significant shifts since that work appeared? So he's asking about the archaeological work in Tibet and all that.
And that book, by the way, is Water Touching Stone, which actually is sort of set on the across the mountain. A lot of it's set across the mountains in Xinjiang province. So there's commentary on the Uyghurs and the problems there. But so archaeology in anywhere in China is massively political, and typically the Chinese government very strictly controls where digs are done and what the purpose of the digs are, the archaeological excavations, and from their perspective, they are obsessed with keeping everything that's found, maintaining or foisting off in a Chinese character. So they're very worried that people are going to find stuff that shows that there were people who were not Chinese in the lands that they. And I'll tell you, if I can digress a little bit here, it's a really interesting story. In Xinjiang, up in the Taklamakan Desert, there are incredible ruins of cultures that existed. They were mostly Muslim cultures, some Buddhists, but also even they believe some Christians. And they have found a number of ruins that had bodies that were mummified because of the very, very dry conditions in the desert. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this goes back probably 20 years, but there is a mummy of a woman that was discovered, and she became, very much a cause of the Uyghur population of the indigenous population of the region, because she was very well preserved and had sort of brunette hair, and a lot of the paintings that they find in these ruins show people with blue eyes. And the Chinese government just loathes that. Okay, the mummy, you can look this up. You can search her and find her. The Beauty of Lulan, and there was a huge effort, a lot of controversy. A lot of people in Beijing did not want. They wanted her to sort of be buried again. But the scientific community finally, over many years, got permission to put her on tour, and I was very excited because she was coming to Philadelphia to the museum at the University of Pennsylvania, which is a wonderful archaeological, anthropological museum. And she was on display. And I set aside an afternoon to go look. And I get there, and I said, and they had this big empty case. And I said, "Where's the Beauty of Lulan?" And the guards just shrugs. And he said, "The people from the embassy came yesterday and took her." And that was such a vivid example of how the communists, try to control these issues. And they, again and again and again. And of course, there are huge archaeological implications. And there's unequivocal proof that the people living, in what's called in the lands of Tibet, even, but certainly what's called Xinjiang today, the Uyghur territories, they were not Chinese. And even, and up in Inner Mongolia, okay, they were Mongolians. They were not Chinese, and it gets a little bit ridiculous because it obviously oppresses scientific knowledge. Okay, there are in these ruins up in Xinjiang, there's clear evidence that there was trade, even before the Silk Road, but trade with Western Europe, and they had clothing that that has been uncovered that is of a fabric that was made in Europe, for example. I mean, there's really fascinating stories being told out of these digs.
Thank you, Eliot. For a next question, we have also from online from our Facebook, and those who are watching this session live, please know you can post, if you have questions for Eliot, please write them in the comments on the Facebook live stream. And if you're watching on our website, please email us at comments@savetibet.org, and we'll pick them up. We now have a question from Kin Posner. He says, why does China fear Tibet more than any other country in the world?
Well, and good question, and I'm sure any of us, any of you from ICT with me could go on a long time about that. I think broadly, very simply, I think what they've done in Tibet is indefensible, and they know it. And they have gone to massive lengths and spent billions of dollars over decades to rip apart the Tibetan culture and to cow the Tibetan people. And in terms of the spirit and the core culture, they have not been successful. And then they see these political movements, and we were chatting earlier about the political opportunity now. There's a clear turning point. We're at a clear pivot point in politically speaking, enabled in getting a critical mass of support in the U.S. Congress and in several European countries to really get more sharply critical of what's going on in Tibet. And so I think they know it's a very weak spot for them, and a great leverage point for the West. I think, and that's why they have such thin skin, and that's why they react so forcefully. But I would, the stronger they react, in a sense, the more optimistic I get, because I think they are beginning to sense they're going to lose.
Thank you, Eliot. Another question we have from Barbara Fidel. So Barbara's question is, with the current situation in Hong Kong, knowing the Chinese can stamp out the right of all Chinese there, and the distressing scene previously in Tiananmen Square when there were demonstrations violently put down, and now taking DNA material from all Chinese males, don't this bodes very negatively for all minority groups, especially Tibetans and Uyghurs? How can this possibly be resolved when other governments won't destroy their own self-interests?
Well, I mean, that it relates back to my prior comments. I mean, I think things are slightly changing because the Chinese are becoming, so much more radicalized and so much more arrogant in their treatment of international norms and even international law. I mean, what they're doing in Hong Kong is a blatant violation of the legal obligations they undertook with Britain. They were not supposed to be, having any influence in Hong Kong politics, and for 50 years, and instead, after 20 years, they're just ignoring those obligations entirely. You can get very discouraged, sort of taking item by item the awful things that are going on. I mean, they are taking, in Xinjiang, back on the comment about DNA, which is very accurate. They're lining up elementary school children and taking DNA from all of the children, so they can sort of find them when they get older in case they do anything against the interest of the government. I mean, that's massively disturbing. But that kind of evidence is getting more and more transparent around the world, which helps the cause. And I think the fact that I think there is cause for optimism around Hong Kong, because the Hong Kong people, in a way, are behaving like Tibetans, being very steadfast and very stubborn, and not afraid to speak out despite the consequences. I mean, if you look at it's all, all relatively speaking, but in terms of I've been in Hong Kong many times, and it's a, thriving city with, feels totally free, and, tremendous freedom of speech. And you look at what they've done, in terms of beating the protesters, arresting protesters, bringing the army in, there's still, so a lot of people will be vastly intimidated by that, but these protests are still going strong. I'm always very interested in stories you see from time to time, because you do at least have the press, mostly still able to access Hong Kong, and these stories about the Hong Kong policemen, having to discipline sometimes members of their own families. It's very difficult for them. I know, and I'm sure it is, and I think there is some of that aspect in Tibet, and I reflected in my novels about the sort of the effect of oppression on the oppressors.
Very much so. So, Eliot, we have still one or two questions coming in. We have one from Pamela Estott, and Pamela says, "I have read all of your books, Eliot, and I love them. I was in Tibet in 2004. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the return of the Dalai Lama. I would love to see it fictionalized, as the reality may never come," she says.
Well, I'm sure that, I'd be interested in hearing from Matteo and others at ICT on that point. Okay, the return of the Dalai Lama is something that we all, hope for, but I think the chances of that happening in his lifetime, I think he's about to turn 85, probably are relatively slim. I think it's more, the issues are more around reincarnation, and many of you know that the Chinese government is trying to regulate has been regulating reincarnation, but there's this very interesting fight going on with Beijing proclaiming that they will decide on who is the next Dalai Lama, and of course the exile government in Dharamsala saying, "No way are you going to do that. We will decide that," and that outcome will be very interesting. And I have thought about introducing more directly the Dalai Lama and Dharamsala in the novels, and I'm sensitive about I don't want to commercialize the Dalai Lama, right? And I'm very respectful, of all that he has done and who he is, and it would be quite a challenge, I think, to turn him into a fictional character and still, maintain proper respect. So I wouldn't say it's never going to happen, but it's I would have a fairly high threshold for doing so.
Yeah, and His Holiness himself has said that, with the current political conditions in China, he doesn't feel, frankly, the need, to go back to Tibet, because he wouldn't be free. So he has said that he would like to stay in India, but what he has said that he would like very much to go and maybe do a pilgrimage, in parts of China or Tibet, to share, his teachings and his wisdom. Yeah.
Talked a little bit about the legislation in the U.S. Congress, and there is this critical mass of support that we haven't seen for many years on Tibetan support, and one of the measures there, as you know, is to push for a U.S. consulate in Lhasa.
Yeah,
I would if that was successful, it would start chipping away at some of this, and a very logical next step, sort of concession that doesn't have to be too radical by Beijing, would be to allow such a pilgrimage. I mean, that would be wonderful in so many different ways.
Yeah, and it's, some people who are, as you know very well, considered in your background, people who are involved in conflict resolution, they say you need some, confidence building measures, So that would show if if the Chinese are really serious, as they, seem to be regarding the institution of the Dalai Lama, why it is important, why China has a connection with it. Well, start with the current one, and you have an opportunity actually to work with someone who's, has been advocating for decades for peaceful resolution and for Chinese and Tibetans living together, making huge concessions, from the historical point of view, from the political point of view. So that would be interesting. But I could see also, and we really appreciate your respect, for the stature and the presence in this world today of His Holiness, and how you, tackle them in your books. But I think the larger, political issue on how this question of Tibet is going to be resolved, it turns around the Dalai Lama. You cannot escape. So maybe sooner or later you'll have to look into that.
Absolutely, and if they would just, if they would just sort of wake up and get practical in Beijing, they should see the current Dalai Lama as an opportunity, okay, not as a threat.
Yeah.
And if they let things go, and the exile community has to, winds up appointing a new Dalai Lama, recognizing the new reincarnation outside of China, it's going to polarize things much more severely, clearly. And while the current Dalai Lama is still with us, bringing him back in Tibet could solve a lot of problems for Beijing right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. For that, and then it would be a dream for Tibetans everywhere for something like that to happen. Well, on that note, I think we have time is up for more questions, but I wanted to read one or two. We had several nice comments here, and I just wanted to share those. We had one from Barbara Brose. She writes, context, complexity, humanity. Thank you, Eliot, for opening minds by opening doors to Tibet through friction that always rings true. And then here's another from Natasha Kern. She writes, thank you for putting what is happening in Tibet in the context of human rights through your novels, making it alive and personal. So we all, from behalf of everyone, wanted to say thank you, Eliot, and hope you'll continue and come back to the Inspector Shan series one more time with a positive ending, we hope.
Well, pleasure. I really appreciate you inviting me today.
Well, thank you very much. And with that, that's the end of our Tibet Talk today with Eliot Pattison. And we'll be back next week, Thursday, another Tibet Talk. We have our guest will be Dr. Eleni Tusimas, and Eleni will be speaking on peace, passion, and purpose, and how she's inspired by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So we look forward to seeing you back with us next week. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.